Sarah Mitchell's heels clicked confidently against the polished floor of Kennedy International Airport's private terminal. The early morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the luxurious waiting area. At 35 years old, she had grown used to these sunrise flights, but today felt different. Something in the air made her hold her head a little higher, grip her designer briefcase a little tighter. The terminal was quiet at 6:30 a.m., with only a few other early morning travelers seated in the plush leather chairs. Sarah checked her reflection in a nearby window. Her dark skin glowed with health, and her carefully pressed navy suit spoke of success and attention to detail. Her natural hair was styled in neat, professional braids, a style she had finally embraced after years of conforming to others' expectations. Right on schedule, she whispered to herself, checking her Rolex. The merger meeting in Chicago wouldn't wait, and as a principal partner at Mitchell and Ross Investment Group, she knew the importance of timing. The deal she was about to close would bring in over $50 million to her firm. As she approached the security checkpoint, Sarah noticed a new face among the staff. A middle-aged white man with a severe expression stood at the podium, his nameplate reading Thomas Weber. He was scanning the terminal with sharp eyes, but when his gaze landed on Sarah, something in his expression changed, a subtle shift she had seen countless times before. Sarah took a deep breath and maintained her professional smile. In her leather tote bag, she had all her documentation ready: her pilot-approved flight plan, identification, and private jet authorization. She had been using this terminal for 5 years now, and most of the staff greeted her by name. But Weber wasn't most staff. "Good morning," Sarah said pleasantly, extending her documents before he could ask. The leather portfolio containing her papers matched her bag, both gifts from her father when she made partner 3 years ago. "I'm headed to Chicago this morning on the Mitchell and Ross jet." Weber barely glanced at the documents. Instead, his eyes traveled from her face to her shoes and back again, his expression growing increasingly skeptical. "This is the private terminal," he said slowly, as if speaking to someone who had wandered in by mistake. "Private jets only." Sarah's smile didn't waver, though something tightened in her chest. "Yes, I'm aware. I'm a principal partner at Mitchell and Ross Investment Group. Our company jet is scheduled for departure at 7:15. She watched as Weber's eyebrows rose slightly. Behind him, Sarah could see Janet, one of the regular security staff, looking concerned. Janet had checked Sarah in hundreds of times before and usually greeted her with a warm hug. "I'll need to see additional verification," Weber said, his tone making it clear he doubted every word she'd spoken. "We have strict protocols here." Sarah noticed how he waved through a white businessman who had walked up to the second security podium, barely glancing at his documents. The man gave Sarah a curious look as he passed, his own private jet credentials dangling carelessly from his hand. With practiced patience, Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out her company ID, pilot clearance forms, and even her bar association card. Though she knew none of these were actually required for entry, she had learned long ago to carry extra documentation, just for moments like these. "I can also have you call our company's aviation department," she offered, her voice carrying the same calm authority she used in board meetings. "Or perhaps Janet over there can verify my identity, as she's checked me in many times before." Weber's jaw tightened at her composed response. He began to scrutinize each document with exaggerated care, holding them up to the light as if checking for watermarks. Behind him, Janet had pulled out her phone and appeared to be texting someone urgently. Sarah stood perfectly still, her expression pleasant but unflinching. In her mind, she could hear her father's voice. "They'll try to shake your confidence, baby girl. Don't let them see you sweat." As a black man who had built his own successful law firm in the 1980s, he had taught her well. She watched as other travelers continued to stream past her position, Weber's strict protocols seemingly applying only to her. But Sarah Mitchell hadn't become one of the youngest partners in her firm's history by backing down from challenges. She knew what was coming next, and despite the frustration building in her chest, she felt the slight curve of a smile forming on her lips. This was going to be interesting. Weber shuffled through Sarah's documents for the third time, making small disapproving noises under his breath. The morning light had grown stronger now, and more travelers were entering the private terminal. Each time someone new approached the security checkpoint, Sarah noticed how Weber would pause his thorough investigation of her papers to wave them through with barely a glance. "There seems to be a problem with these documents," Weber said, his voice carrying just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "They look unusual." He emphasized the last word while staring directly at Sarah, as if daring her to challenge him. Sarah maintained her professional posture, though she noticed her hand tightening slightly around the handle of her briefcase. 20 years of dealing with similar situations had taught her that reaction was exactly what people like Weber wanted. Instead, she pulled out her phone and opened her calendar app. "What exactly seems unusual about my pilot-approved flight plan or my company ID?" she asked calmly, her voice clear and measured. "I'd be happy to explain any details you're unsure about." As she spoke, she started recording a voice memo on her phone, something her father had always advised her to do in situations like this. Weber's face reddened slightly when he noticed her phone. "Phones aren't allowed in the security area," he snapped, though several other travelers nearby were openly using their devices. "Actually," Sarah replied, her tone remaining professional, "according to the terminal's posted rules right behind you, phones are permitted in all areas except the tarmac. But I understand you're new here, so you might not be familiar with all the policies yet." Janet, the regular security staff member, had moved closer now. She looked increasingly uncomfortable as she watched the situation unfold. Sarah caught her eye and gave her a small nod, silently communicating that everything was under control. "Listen here," Weber said, lowering his voice and leaning forward over his podium. "We get all kinds trying to sneak into the private terminal. People who think they can fake their way onto these jets. I'm just doing my job making sure everyone belongs here." Sarah raised one eyebrow slightly. "All kinds of people?" she repeated, her voice steady. "Could you clarify what you mean by that, Mr. Weber?" The security guard shifted uncomfortably, aware that she was carefully documenting his words. "I mean, people who don't look like they could afford private jets," he muttered, his eyes darting to her expensive suit and designer bags before returning to her face with obvious doubt. "That's an interesting observation," Sarah said, pulling out her business card and placing it on the podium. "Especially since my company recently acquired ownership of this private aviation service. So technically, Mr. Weber, I'm not just a passenger. I'm one of your employer's new owners." Weber's face went through several expressions in quick succession: disbelief, confusion, and the beginning traces of fear. But instead of backing down, he seemed to dig in deeper. "Anyone can print fancy business cards," he said, pushing her card back toward her without looking at it. "I'll need to call my supervisor for verification." Sarah checked her watch again. 6:45 a.m., of course, she said smoothly. "Please do. And while you're at it, could you explain to your supervisor why you've delayed a principal partner for 30 minutes while waving through every other passenger without similar scrutiny? I'm sure they'll be very interested in reviewing the security footage of this interaction." The color drained from Weber's face as he glanced up at the security cameras he had forgotten about. Behind him, Janet was now openly on her phone, speaking in urgent whispers. Sarah stood patiently, her expression neutral but confident. She thought about all the young black professionals who would come through this terminal after her, who might face the same treatment. Her slight smile wasn't just about her own situation anymore. It was about making sure this became a turning point. In the distance, she could hear rapid footsteps approaching. The terminal manager was hurrying toward the security checkpoint, his face a mask of concern. Sarah's smile widened just slightly. The real conversation was about to begin, and she was more than ready for it. Weber's hands were now visibly shaking as he pretended to continue examining her documents. He could hear the approaching footsteps too, and for the first time since Sarah had walked up to his podium, uncertainty crept into his expression. The next few minutes were going to be very interesting indeed. The terminal manager, Mr. James Richardson, arrived at the security checkpoint looking both worried and angry. He was a tall man in his 50s, dressed in a crisp gray suit, and Sarah recognized him from her many previous flights through the terminal. His face showed immediate recognition when he saw her. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, slightly out of breath from his quick walk across the terminal. "I just got word there was some issue with your documentation." The way he said it made it clear he knew there couldn't possibly be any real problem. Before Sarah could respond, Weber jumped in. "Sir, I was just following protocols. These credentials need extra verification and... Extra verification? Mr. Richardson cut him off sharply. Ms. Mitchell has been flying through this terminal for 5 years. She's one of our most valued clients. He turned to Sarah with an apologetic expression. I'm so sorry for this delay, Ms. Mitchell. Please, let me escort you to your jet personally. But Weber wasn't done yet. Something in him seemed to snap as he watched his authority slipping away. Sir, with all due respect, we can't just let people through because they're regular clients. How do we know she didn't steal these credentials? These kinds of scams are becoming more common, you know. The terminal fell silent. Several nearby passengers stopped their conversations to stare. Sarah noticed phones being pulled out, some pointing in their direction. She maintained her composed expression, but inside, she felt a familiar mix of anger and determination rising. These kinds of scams. Sarah repeated quietly, her voice carrying in the silence. Would you mind explaining exactly what kinds of scams you're referring to, Mr. Weber? And while you're at it, perhaps you could explain why you've subjected me to 30 minutes of questioning while letting everyone else through with barely a glance at their papers. Weber's face turned red again. I'm just saying that some people try to take advantage. They see how the other half lives and think they can just walk in here and... Stop talking, Weber, right now. Mr. Richardson's voice was ice cold. Security, please escort Mr. Weber to my office. He gestured to 2 security officers who had appeared nearby. Ms. Mitchell, would you be willing to give a statement about this incident? Our company has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. Sarah nodded, but her attention was on the growing crowd of onlookers. She saw faces filled with shock, sympathy, and in some cases, recognition of their own similar experiences. A young black businessman in the crowd caught her eye and gave her a subtle nod of respect. I'll be happy to provide a statement, Sarah said clearly. In fact, I have a recording of the entire interaction. She held up her phone. I think it will be particularly interesting to review this alongside the security camera footage, especially the part where Mr. Weber suggested I might have stolen my credentials. Weber's face went from red to pale. I didn't mean, he stammered, but the security officers were already moving to escort him away. Miss Mitchell, Mr. Richardson said quietly, I want you to know that this will be dealt with immediately. This is not what our company stands for, especially now that we're part of the Mitchell and Ross family. Sarah noticed how Weber's shoulders stiffened at those words. He finally seemed to realize exactly who he had been harassing. The security officers led him away as he kept looking back, his face a mix of fear and disbelief. Janet, who had been watching everything unfold, stepped forward. I'm so sorry, Sarah, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I should have stepped in sooner. Sarah turned to her with a gentle smile. You did the right thing by calling management, Janet. Sometimes it's better to let these situations play out fully. Change doesn't happen when problems are swept under the rug. Looking at her watch, Sarah saw it was now 7:00 a.m. Her flight to Chicago was still on schedule, but she knew this morning's events would have implications far beyond her delayed boarding. As Mr. Richardson began leading her toward her gate, she could hear the murmur of conversations behind her, people discussing what they'd just witnessed. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about making sure the next person wouldn't have to go through the same experience. And somehow, that made the whole ordeal worth it. As Mr. Richardson led Sarah toward her gate, a tall woman in an expensive suit came rushing through the terminal doors. Sarah recognized her immediately as Victoria Hayes, the Regional Director of Aviation Operations. Her presence at this early hour showed just how quickly word had traveled up the corporate ladder. Ms. Mitchell, Victoria called out, slightly breathless from her rush into the terminal. I came as soon as I heard. This is completely unacceptable. Her face showed genuine distress as she joined Sarah and Mr. Richardson. Sarah maintained her professional composure, though she was touched by the quick response from senior management. I appreciate you coming down personally, Ms. Hayes, she said. Though I hope you didn't have to cancel any important meetings. Victoria shook her head firmly. Nothing is more important than addressing this situation. When I heard that one of our new board members was being harassed by security personnel, she paused, collecting herself. We've had other complaints about Mr. Weber's behavior, but nothing this blatant. Mr. Richardson looked surprised. Other complaints? Why wasn't I informed? They were more subtle incidents, Victoria explained as they walked through the terminal. Comments here and there, extra random checks of certain passengers. Nothing that could be definitively proven until now. Sarah listened carefully, her legal training kicking in. How long has he been working here? She asked, pulling out her phone to take notes. 3 weeks, Mr. Richardson replied. He came highly recommended from another airport, though now I'm wondering about the circumstances of his departure from there. They reached the private lounge area, where Victoria gestured for them to sit. The leather chairs were comfortable, but Sarah remained perched on the edge of her seat, alert and focused. Ms. Mitchell, Victoria said, her voice serious, I know you have an important meeting in Chicago, but I would greatly appreciate it if you could spare a few minutes to discuss this incident in detail. As our new parent company's representative, your input on how we handle this situation would be invaluable. Sarah checked her watch, 7:05 a.m. Her pilot had already messaged that they could make up time in the air. Of course, she agreed, setting her briefcase aside. I think it's important we address this systematically. Just then, Janet appeared with Sarah's favorite tea, honey lemon green tea, which she'd ordered countless times during early morning flights. The small gesture of familiarity and respect stood in stark contrast to Weber's treatment. Thank you, Janet, Sarah said warmly, then turned back to Victoria. I think we need to discuss more than just Mr. Weber. This is an opportunity to review all our security protocols and training procedures. Victoria nodded eagerly, pulling out her tablet to take notes. Absolutely. In fact, would you be willing to have Mitchell and Ross's diversity and inclusion team consult with us on updating our training programs? As they talked, Sarah noticed other travelers in the terminal watching them with interest. The story of what had happened was clearly spreading. She saw phones being used and suspected the incident would soon appear on social media. I think, Sarah said carefully, this is a chance to set a new standard for private aviation security, one that maintains strict safety protocols while ensuring every legitimate traveler is treated with respect and dignity. Mr. Richardson, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. Ms. Mitchell, I want you to know that Weber's termination paperwork is already being processed. But I agree, we need to do more than just remove one problematic employee. Sarah took a sip of her tea, considering her next words carefully. I'd like to review the security footage from the past 3 weeks, she said. Not just of Weber, but all security checkpoints. Let's see if we can identify any patterns that need addressing. Victoria and Mr. Richardson exchanged glances. Of course, Victoria agreed quickly. We'll have all the footage compiled and sent to your office by tomorrow. Sarah stood up, smoothing her suit. Good. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a merger to close in Chicago. But I'll be back tomorrow, and we can begin implementing changes then. As she walked toward her gate, flanked by both Victoria and Mr. Richardson, Sarah felt a sense of purpose. What had started as an unpleasant confrontation was transforming into an opportunity for real change. Sometimes, she thought, the most important victories came from the most difficult moments. As Sarah approached her private jet, a commotion erupted behind her. She turned to see Weber, who had apparently broken away from the security officers, rushing toward the terminal's main area. His face was red with anger and desperation. This is ridiculous, he shouted, drawing attention from everyone in the terminal. You can't fire me for doing my job. I was protecting this terminal from people who don't belong here. Victoria Hayes stepped forward, her voice sharp and clear. Mr. Weber, you need to leave the premises immediately. She nodded to the security officers who were quickly catching up to him. But Weber wasn't finished. He pointed at Sarah, his hand shaking. Do you know how many people tried to sneak in here, acting like they owned the place? Sarah turned fully around now, her heels clicking on the polished floor as she took 3 steps toward him. The terminal had gone completely silent. Even the usual airport announcements seemed to have paused. Actually, Mr. Weber, she said calmly, I do own this place, or at least my company does. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a newspaper. It was yesterday's Wall Street Journal, with a headline clearly visible. Mitchell and Ross Investment Group acquires leading private aviation company in $2.8 billion deal. Weber's face went from red to ashen as Sarah held up the paper. His eyes darted from the headline to her face and back again. That's not possible, he stammered. Victoria stepped forward, her tablet in hand. Allow me to formally introduce Sarah Mitchell, founding partner of Mitchell and Ross Investment Group, and as of yesterday, a member of our parent company's board of directors. The security officers had reached Weber now, but they hardly needed to restrain him. He stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing without words coming out. Mr. Weber, Sarah continued, her voice carrying through the silent terminal, you made a lot of assumptions this morning. You assumed I couldn't afford private travel. You assumed my credentials were fake. You assumed I didn't belong here. She paused, letting her words sink in. But your biggest mistake was assuming you could judge someone's worth by the color of their skin. A young black woman in the terminal began to applaud, and others quickly joined in. Sarah raised her hand for quiet. She wasn't done yet. This isn't about ownership or status, she said, addressing not just Weber, but everyone in the terminal. This is about basic human dignity. Every person who walks through these doors deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their appearance. Victoria nodded firmly. And that's exactly why we're implementing immediate changes to our security protocols and training procedures. She turned to Weber. Your termination is effective immediately, and I suggest you leave quietly before we add trespassing to the list of incidents in your file. Weber's shoulders slumped in defeat. As the security officers led him away, Sarah could hear him muttering, I didn't know. How was I supposed to know? Mr. Richardson approached Sarah with her boarding documents. Your pilot says they can still get you to Chicago on time, Ms. Mitchell, and I've already called ahead to ensure you won't face any similar issues at the arrival terminal. Sarah took the documents with a graceful nod. Thank you, but please make sure all terminals know that every passenger deserves the same courtesy, not just the ones who own the company. As she finally walked toward her jet, Sarah heard snippets of conversation behind her. Did you see how she handled that? I can't believe he didn't even look at her credentials properly. That's Sarah Mitchell. My daughter did a business school case study about her. Sarah smiled slightly as she climbed the steps to her jet. The pilot greeted her warmly, and her assistant was already inside, preparing documents for the Chicago meeting. Interesting morning, her assistant asked, noting Sarah's expression. You could say that, Sarah replied, settling into her leather seat. But I think some good will come from it. She pulled out her phone and began typing an email to her HR department. Changes were coming to the private aviation industry, and Sarah Mitchell was going to make sure they were meaningful and lasting. On the flight to Chicago, Sarah Mitchell opened her laptop and began typing an email that would change the aviation industry forever. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard as she outlined her plan for immediate action. Victoria Hayes had already sent her the security footage from the past 3 weeks. Sarah watched portions of it during her flight, her expression growing more determined with each clip. The videos showed a clear pattern. Weber had consistently delayed, questioned, and harassed passengers of color while waving through white travelers with minimal checks. Ms. Mitchell, her assistant Jessica said, interrupting her concentration. The incident is already trending on social media. Several passengers recorded everything on their phones. Sarah nodded, unsurprised. She opened Twitter on her phone and saw the hashtag #PrivateJetKaren. The Weber was male, the term had stuck, climbing rapidly. Videos showed multiple angles of the confrontation, with most comments supporting her composed handling of the situation. Perfect timing, Sarah said, returning to her email. This will make our next steps even more impactful. Her email was addressed to the entire board of directors at both Mitchell and Ross and the recently acquired aviation company. The subject line read, Immediate action required. Security protocol overhaul. As Sarah wrote, the plane cruised smoothly through clear skies. She outlined a comprehensive plan. 1. Immediate review of all security personnel across all terminals. 2. Installation of new body cameras for all security staff. 3. Monthly analysis of security interaction data to identify any racial patterns. 4. Mandatory bi-weekly anti-bias training for all employees. 5. Anonymous reporting system for passengers who experience discrimination. 6. Creation of a diverse oversight committee to review security practices. Her phone buzzed with a message from her father. Saw the videos, baby girl. You handled it exactly right. Your mother would have been proud. Sarah smiled, touching the small locket she wore that had belonged to her late mother. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ms. Mitchell, we're about 30 minutes from Chicago. We made up the lost time." Sarah thanked him and continued working. She opened another document and began drafting a press release. The aviation company needed to get ahead of this story, and she was determined to make it about positive change rather than just one incident of discrimination. Her phone kept buzzing with notifications. Major news networks were picking up the story. Headlines were already appearing. Aviation executive faces discrimination at her own terminal. Racist security guard gets lesson in assumptions. Mitchell and Ross partner shows grace under pressure. Jessica handed her a tablet showing more security footage that had just arrived. "Look at this, Ms. Mitchell." They found similar incidents at Weber's previous job. Sarah watched the new footage with a frown. It showed Weber creating the same problems at another airport, but his actions had been quietly swept under the rug. He had resigned before any official action could be taken. "Add another point to the email," Sarah told Jessica. "We need thorough background checks that include reviewing security footage from previous employers. No more hiding bad behavior by quietly moving to another airport." The plane began its descent into Chicago. Sarah finished her email with a firm closing paragraph. "This incident, while unfortunate, gives us an opportunity to set new standards for the private aviation industry. I expect immediate implementation of these changes across all our terminals. We will be the industry leader not just in luxury travel, but in equality and dignity for all our passengers." She hit send just as the plane touched down. Her phone immediately began ringing with board members responding to her email. Sarah smiled, knowing that real change was already in motion. As she gathered her things to deplane, Jessica showed her one last social media post. It was from the young black woman who had started the applause in the terminal. "Watched a queen handle racism with pure class today, then found out she owns the whole company. Sometimes justice is beautiful. Hashtag Black Excellence, hashtag Private Jet Karen." Sarah stepped off the plane into the Chicago sunshine, ready for her merger meeting, but already planning her return to New York. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities for change, and Sarah Mitchell was ready for all of them. The merger meeting in Chicago went perfectly. Sarah's composed handling of the morning's incident had only reinforced her reputation as a leader who could manage any situation. As her private jet took off for the return flight to New York that evening, her phone was still buzzing with messages of support and media requests. "Ms. Mitchell," Jessica said, handing her a tablet, "the board has unanimously approved all your proposed changes. They'd already started implementing the new security measures at every terminal." Sarah scrolled through the response emails, noting how quickly things were moving. Victoria Hayes had sent hourly updates throughout the day. 10 a.m., all security staff now wearing body cameras. 12 p.m., anti-bias training scheduled for next week. 2 p.m., new anonymous reporting system already online. 4 p.m., diverse oversight committee members being selected. 6 p.m., installation of new security cameras with better coverage. "They're moving fast," Sarah commented, pleased with the quick response. "How's the media coverage looking?" Jessica pulled up several news websites on her laptop. The story had evolved throughout the day. Morning headlines about discrimination had given way to afternoon stories about positive change in the aviation industry. Sarah's email outlining the new security protocols had been leaked and was receiving praise from civil rights organizations. "Social media is overwhelmingly supportive," Jessica added. "Your handling of the situation is being used as a case study in several business schools already. They're calling it the Mitchell Method, maintaining dignity while creating change." Sarah looked out the plane window at the sunset, thinking about how much had happened in just one day. Her phone buzzed with a text from Janet, the security staff member from the morning. "You'll never believe what happened after you left. 5 different passengers came to thank me for helping report Weber. They shared their own stories of discrimination at other airports. Change is happening." The plane's Wi-Fi dinged with a new email. It was from Weber's previous employer, reaching out to apologize. They admitted to letting him resign quietly instead of addressing his behavior, and they wanted to implement similar changes to their security protocols. "Ms. Mitchell," the pilot called from the cockpit, "we have a message from Kennedy International. The evening staff would like to meet with you when we land. They want to share some ideas about improving passenger experiences." Sarah smiled. Tell them I'll be happy to meet them. She opened her laptop to review the day's accomplishments. Weber had been officially terminated, with the incident recorded in a new industry database to prevent similar issues at other airports. Security staff across all terminals were receiving new training and equipment. A passenger advocacy group was being formed to review and improve security procedures. 3 other major private aviation companies had reached out about adopting similar anti-discrimination measures. The company's stock had actually risen as investors responded positively to the quick and decisive handling of the situation. Looking at her phone again, Sarah saw a message from a young black girl who wanted to be a pilot. "Thank you for showing us how to stand up with grace. You're my new hero." The message reminded Sarah of her own journey. 20 years ago, she had been that young girl, dreaming of success in a world that often seemed determined to hold her back. Now she was in a position to make real change. As the plane began its descent into New York, Sarah drafted one more email. This one went to every employee in both Mitchell and Ross and their new aviation subsidiary. Today showed us that one person's bias can hurt many, but one moment of change can help even more. Let's make sure every passenger, regardless of their appearance, receives the same high level of service we promise. Success isn't just about reaching the top, it's about holding the door open for others to follow. The city lights sparkled below as they approached Kennedy International. Sarah could see the private terminal where everything had started just that morning. It looked different now, not just a place where she had faced discrimination, but a place where real change had begun. Jessica looked up from her tablet one last time. "The evening security staff is waiting to greet you. They've already completed their first anti-bias training session." Sarah gathered her things, ready to face whatever came next. Sometimes the best victories came from the hardest challenges, and she was ready to make sure this victory counted for everyone who would come after her. 1 month after the incident, Sarah Mitchell stood in the same private terminal where it had all begun. The changes were immediately visible. New signs welcomed all travelers in multiple languages. Security staff wore body cameras and professional smiles. Most importantly, the atmosphere felt different, more welcoming, more inclusive. "Good morning, Ms. Mitchell," called out Marcus, one of the new security officers hired as part of the terminal's diversity initiative. He was a young black man with a military background and a degree in aviation security. "Early flight to Boston today." Sarah nodded, presenting her credentials out of habit, though everyone in the terminal knew who she was now. The security check was thorough but respectful, exactly the same as it was for every other passenger. "The new protocols are working well," Marcus reported as he completed his check. "We haven't had a single complaint about discrimination in the past month, and our security efficiency has actually improved." Looking around the terminal, Sarah could see the truth in his words. A diverse group of travelers moved smoothly through security. The new body cameras blinked quietly, recording every interaction. Above the security desk, a clear sign displayed a QR code for anonymous feedback. Victoria Hayes approached, carrying a thick report. "Ms. Mitchell, I have the first month's data for you." She opened the folder, revealing charts and statistics. Security wait times are down 30%. Passenger satisfaction is up 45%. And we've received over 200 positive comments about the new inclusive atmosphere. Sarah took the report, noting the detailed breakdown of security interactions by race, gender, and age. The data showed consistent treatment across all demographics, exactly what she had hoped to achieve. "How's the industry-wide initiative going?" Sarah asked, referring to the new aviation equality program that had grown from the incident. Victoria smiled proudly. 12 major private aviation companies have adopted our protocols. The industry journal is calling it the Mitchell Standard now. Even commercial airlines are starting to implement similar changes. A group of young aviation management trainees passed by, part of the new diversity program Sarah had initiated. They were learning every aspect of terminal operations, preparing to become the next generation of aviation leaders. Sarah's phone buzzed with a news alert. The aviation industry's leading magazine had just published its annual rankings. The headline made her smile. "Mitchell and Ross Aviation sets new industry standard for security and inclusion." Janet, who had been promoted to head of terminal operations, approached with a cup of Sarah's favorite honey lemon green tea. "Remember that young girl who wrote to you about wanting to be a pilot?" she asked. She's starting flight school next month. Her parents said your story inspired her to pursue her dreams. Sarah sipped her tea, remembering her own journey. The terminal's wall now displayed a new mission statement: excellence in aviation, equality in service. Below it hung framed photos of diverse aviation pioneers, inspiring the next generation. Miss Mitchell, Jessica called, hurrying over with a tablet. The Weber incident is now a case study at Harvard Business School. They're teaching future business leaders how to turn discrimination into institutional change. Sarah checked her watch, still 20 minutes before her flight. She used the time to walk through the terminal, observing the changes. The new security staff was diverse and professional. The anonymous feedback kiosk linked with recent positive reviews. A wall-mounted screen displayed real-time statistics about security wait times and passenger satisfaction scores. Near her gate, she overheard a conversation between two passengers. "I used to hate going through security here." "Me too. Now it's the best terminal in the country." As Sarah finally boarded her flight, she thought about Weber. She had heard he was working as a security guard at a shopping mall now, required to complete extensive anti-bias training before being hired. The pilot welcomed her aboard with a smile. "Beautiful morning for flying, Ms. Mitchell. Boston weather is clear." Sarah settled into her seat, opening the industry magazine to read more about the changes her experience had sparked. Sometimes, she thought, the worst moments led to the best outcomes. 1 month had transformed not just a terminal, but an industry's approach to equality. Looking out the window at the sunrise, Sarah smiled. The terminal below wasn't just a place where she had faced discrimination anymore. It had become a model for change, a symbol of progress, and a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever been judged by their appearance rather than their worth. The future was looking brighter, one flight at a time.